The wedding presents sat unopened, 3 days after the reception, a silent testament to the celebration that abruptly ended in murder. In a quiet East Cobb neighborhood of Marietta, Georgia, the meticulously tied ribbons and glossy paper wrapped around hopeful gifts remained undisturbed in the living room of the small ranch house on Willow Creek Drive. Outside, the late June heat pressed down, wilting the last of the floral arrangements left by the front door. Police tape, a stark yellow line against the manicured green lawn, circled the property, a barrier between the recent past and the grim present. Inside, the air was still, heavy with the clinical scent of forensic chemicals, a stark contrast to the lingering faint perfume of the bride and the celebratory notes of champagne from the previous weekend. The undisturbed breakfast table, set for two with cheerful patterned plates, suggested a morning that never arrived. A coffee maker stood cold, its carafe empty. This was not a scene of forced entry or ransacking. It was a tableau frozen in time, interrupted by violence that left few immediate, obvious clues. The call came into the Cobb County Police Department dispatch just before noon on Tuesday, June. It was the groom, Mark Peterson, his voice tight with a mixture of confusion and rising panic. He reported his new wife, Sarah Jenkins Peterson, missing. She hadn't been seen since Sunday night, after the wedding reception concluded at the Roswell Historic Cottage. Mark had assumed she was sleeping late on Monday, then perhaps running errands. He hadn't worried until she didn't answer his calls or text throughout the day, and her car was still in the driveway. By Tuesday morning, a sense of unease had settled into a cold dread. He described Sarah, vibrant and full of life just days before, now vanished from their home. Officers were dispatched to the Willow Creek Drive address. They found no signs of forced entry, no struggle in the main living areas. The house appeared neat, almost unnervingly so. Sarah's purse was on the kitchen counter. Her phone charger was plugged in beside the bed. Her vehicle, a silver sedan, was parked exactly where she always left it. It seemed as though she had simply ceased to exist within the confines of her own home. Investigators conducted a preliminary search, their movements methodical and precise within the confined space. They checked closets, the garage, the small backyard. Nothing immediately indicated foul play or her presence. Mark Peterson, visibly distressed, was interviewed on the scene. He recounted the events of the wedding day and the reception. He stated they arrived home around 11:30 p.m. on Sunday. Sarah had complained of being tired. He remembered her saying she wanted to get out of her dress. He had gone downstairs to the basement man cave to watch television for a short while. He wasn't sure exactly when he fell asleep, but it was sometime after midnight. He woke up Monday morning, noticed Sarah wasn't in bed, but assumed she was already up or maybe in the shower. He had work that day. He left the house around 7:30 a.m., calling out goodbye, but received no response. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. His description of their arrival home was calm. No arguments, no tension, he claimed. Just the quiet end to a long celebratory day. The initial missing person report quickly escalated. Detectives arriving on the scene felt the silence of the house was not just quiet, but profoundly empty. Wrong. The undisturbed nature of the living areas contradicted the fact of a missing person who would normally leave some trace of her morning routine. A more thorough search commenced. It was Detective Miles Corbin, a seasoned investigator, with a quiet, persistent demeanor, who made the discovery. The small guest bedroom, seldom used, was located down a short hallway off the living room. The door was slightly ajar. The room was sparsely furnished. A bed, a dresser, a single armchair. The blinds were drawn, casting the room in shadow. Detective Corbin pushed the door open fully. The air in the room felt colder, heavier, and there, partially obscured by the armchair, was Sarah. The scene in the guest bedroom was grim. Sarah Jenkins Peterson lay on the floor. There was no blood immediately visible, suggesting the method of death was not a stabbing or gunshot in that location. Her position was unnatural, indicating she had been placed there, or collapsed in a specific way. The lack of overt signs of struggle in the main house now made chilling sense. The incident, whatever it was, seemed confined to this one room. The police tape outside took on a new, definitive meaning. This was no longer a missing person case. It was a homicide investigation. The wedding confetti on the sidewalk felt like a cruel mockery, bright and festive just yards from where a life had been brutally extinguished. The initial shock among responding officers was palpable. quickly followed by the methodical, professional detachment required for processing a potential crime scene. The priority shifted from finding Sarah to documenting every minute detail surrounding her death. Crime scene investigators were called in. The house on Willow Creek Drive became a hub of quiet, focused activity. Every surface was examined, photographed, cataloged. The small guest bedroom was the epicenter of their attention. They meticulously documented Sarah's position, the state of her clothing, the condition of the room. Trace evidence technicians swept the floor, furniture, and wall. Luminol was sprayed, revealing potential blood spatter or cleanup attempts, not visible to the naked eye. Though initial results were minimal in the main areas, fingerprint experts dusted surfaces throughout the house, hoping to identify anyone who shouldn't have been there, or to confirm the presence of those who should. The early assessment suggested strangulation or suffocation as the likely cause of death, given the absence of obvious external trauma like gunshot wounds or deep cuts. This would require confirmation from the medical examiner. Mark Peterson was taken to the Cobb County Police Department for a formal interview. His initial distress remained evident, but detectives noted a certain distance in his recounting of the events. He answered questions about his relationship with Sarah, their wedding day, and the time they arrived home. He reiterated his account of going to the basement. When asked about potential enemies or conflicts Sarah might have had, he seemed hesitant, searching for answers. He described Sarah as generally well-liked, but admitted she could be outgoing, sometimes a bit much for traditional sensibilities. This vagueness didn't offer concrete leads, but it registered with investigators. They needed to understand Sarah's life beyond the filtered perspective of a grieving spouse, especially a new one. The timeline of their arrival home and his subsequent actions in the basement would need independent verification, if possible. The news spread quickly through the East Cobb community. A wedding weekend ending in murder was a shock that fractured the suburban calm. Neighbors on Willow Creek Drive watched from behind drawn blinds as the police vehicles came and went. They offered brief, stunned statements to local news crews. They seemed like a nice young couple. Just married? It's terrible. Never saw anything out of the ordinary. These initial reactions painted a picture of suburban normalcy abruptly shattered, offering little insight into the dynamics within the Peterson home. The focus of the investigation began to broaden. Detectives needed to reconstruct Sarah's last known hours, not just from Mark's account, but from everyone who saw her at the wedding reception. The Roswell Historic Cottage, a picturesque venue often booked for weddings, became the next focal point for investigators. They obtained the guest list from the wedding planners. Hundreds of names. Each person who attended the reception was now a potential witness, or potentially something more. Detectives began the tedious process of contacting guests. They asked about Sarah's demeanor at the reception, who she interacted with, if there were any signs of arguments or distress. Initial feedback was consistent. Sarah was happy, celebrating, seemingly enjoying her wedding day. However, as more guests were interviewed, subtle discrepancies and observations began to emerge, painting a slightly more complex picture than the simple narrative of a joyful bride. Several guests mentioned Sarah seemed to be drinking heavily. Others noted specific interactions that, in retrospect, seemed strained. Witness statements began to coalesce around interactions Sarah had with members of Mark's family. While many recalled her being social and engaging, some guests mentioned seeing Sarah speaking intensely with Mark's father, David Peterson, near the bar area late in the evening. A cousin of Mark's told an investigator, "She was laughing a little too loud with David. It just seemed off, like she was trying too hard, or maybe they were having a serious talk but trying to hide it." Another witness, a friend of Sarah's from college, mentioned seeing Sarah in a quiet corner with Mark's uncle, Robert Peterson, earlier in the night. "They were talking really close," she reported. "It looked private. She seemed a bit flustered when I walked by." These seemingly innocent observations, initially dismissed by the guests as wedding interactions, began to draw a quiet line of inquiry for the detectives. The focus on the immediate family intensified. Investigators delved deeper into the backgrounds of Mark, David, and Robert Peterson. Mark, a software engineer, had a clean record. David, Mark's father, was a respected local businessman, involved in real estate development in the Cobb County area. He was in his early 60s, known for being reserved and successful. Robert, Mark's uncle, David's younger brother, was a contractor. His background was less publicly visible than David's, Initial inquiries into the family dynamics revealed they were close-knit, though David was considered the quiet patriarch, while Robert was known to be more gregarious and sometimes volatile. The family home, where David and Robert lived separately but within a few miles of each other in East Cobb, became points of interest. The medical examiner's report provided crucial initial findings. The cause of death was confirmed as asphyxiation, likely manual strangulation. There were faint, non-specific marks on Sarah's neck consistent with this. The time of death was estimated to be late Sunday night, or very early Monday morning, placing it squarely within the time frame after she and Mark arrived home from the reception. The report also noted the presence of alcohol in Sarah's system, consistent with consumption at a wedding reception. Critically, the autopsy revealed evidence of recent sexual activity. This finding added a disturbing new layer to the investigation, transforming the case from a potential argument or sudden violence into something potentially more complex, involving sexual dynamics that were not immediately apparent from the serene crime scene. With the confirmation of sexual activity, the focus on interactions at the reception intensified dramatically. Who was Sarah with after she left the reception? Who came back to the house? If anyone, besides Mark. Mark Peterson was re-interviewed. When confronted with the medical examiner's finding of sexual activity, his demeanor shifted. He became defensive, insisting that they had not had sex after returning home. He maintained his story about going to the basement. His alibi for the crucial time frame was essentially himself, alone in the basement. This lack of a verifiable alibi, coupled with the forensic findings, immediately made Mark a primary suspect. However, detectives kept the scope wide, considering other possibilities, especially given the witness statements about interactions at the reception. Investigators began collecting DNA samples from Mark Peterson for comparison with any trace evidence found at the scene, particularly any potential foreign DNA related to the sexual activity or the strangulation. They also requested samples from David and Robert Peterson. This request was made under the guise of routine elimination samples, necessary because they were present at the wedding and potentially in the house at some point, a common practice in investigations involving close family members. Both men cooperated, though sources close to the investigation later noted a palpable tension during the process. The anticipation of the DNA results introduced a period of waiting, a common element in forensic investigations that can either clear suspects or irrevocably link them to the crime. While awaiting the critical DNA results, detectives returned to dissecting the timeline of Sunday night. They obtained security footage from the Roswell Historic Cottage and nearby businesses, hoping to track guests' movements. They reviewed phone records for Sarah, Mark, David, and Robert. Sarah's phone records showed numerous texts and calls throughout Sunday, culminating in a few late-night texts that abruptly stopped around midnight. These communications became intensely scrutinized. One particular exchange caught the attention of investigators. It was a series of texts between Sarah and an unsaved number that detectives linked to a burner phone. The messages were deleted from Sarah's phone, but forensic recovery efforts managed to retrieve fragments. They were cryptic, urgent, and hinted at a clandestine meeting or arrangement. The fragments were not fully decipherable, but the tone was clear, secretive, and potentially problematic. The retrieved text fragments, though incomplete, suggested a planned encounter after the reception. One text read, "Meet me later. Around 12:30. Don't tell." Another referenced the usual place and a sense of risk. The recipient of these texts remained unknown, but the timestamp placed them after the reception concluded, and around the time Sarah and Mark would have arrived home. This finding cast a significant shadow over Mark's account of a quiet return home and immediate separation. It suggested Sarah had intentions that differed from his description. Investigators focused on identifying the owner of the burner phone and understanding the context of these secret communications. This development added a new layer of complexity. Sarah was potentially involved in a secret relationship or encounter, unrelated to the wedding itself, that might have led to her death. The search for the owner of the burner phone led investigators down a series of digital breadcrumbs. The phone was activated recently and used minimally, primarily for text with Sarah's number. Tracking its location history proved difficult due to the nature of the device, but cell tower data provided general proximity at key times. On the night of the murder, the phone pinged off towers in the East Cobb area, consistent with being near Sarah's house on Willow Creek Drive. This placed the anonymous texter in the immediate vicinity during the estimated time of death. This new, unknown individual became a person of interest, adding another layer of uncertainty to the already complex family dynamics under scrutiny. The investigation into Sarah's past relationships revealed a history that was more complicated than Mark had initially portrayed. Friends and former colleagues described Sarah as charismatic and independent, but also someone who navigated relationships with a certain degree of secrecy. There were whispers of past affairs, of relationships that overlapped. This background information, while not directly implicating anyone in her murder, provided context for the possibility of secret communications and clandestine meetings. It suggested that the burner phone might not be linked to a random threat, but rather to someone from her past, or perhaps someone closer than initially assumed. Weeks passed as forensic tests were processed. The pressure on the investigation mounted. The community in Marietta remained on edge. The yellow tape around the Willow Creek Drive house was a constant, grim reminder of the violence that had occurred. The media coverage, initially intense, settled into a watchful waiting pattern, reporting on the slow, deliberate pace of the forensic investigation. The silence from the Peterson family was noted. Mark Peterson had retreated from public view, presumably grieving. David and Robert Peterson continued their daily lives, under the quiet, persistent observation of investigators. Then came the forensic breakthrough. DNA analysis from trace evidence collected from underneath Sarah's fingernails provided a profile. It was not Mark Peterson's. It was not an unknown profile. It matched a sample already in the system, collected during the routine elimination process. The DNA belonged to Robert Peterson, Mark's uncle. This finding was explosive. It placed Robert Peterson in physical contact with Sarah, likely during a struggle, around the time of her death. This wasn't just a random profile, it was family. The secret texts from the burner phone now took on a terrifying new potential meaning. Could Robert Peterson be the owner of the burner phone? Could the clandestine meeting referenced in the retrieved texts have been with him? Investigators cross-referenced the burner phone data with Robert Peterson's known associates and movements. While the burner phone was designed for anonymity, digital footprints are rarely truly erased. They found a connection. The burner phone was purchased with cash at a convenience store where Robert Peterson was known to be a regular customer, captured on the store's security footage on the day of purchase. Cell tower data for the burner phone also matched Robert Peterson's known locations at various times before the murder, including being in close proximity to Sarah's workplace on several occasions in the weeks leading up to the wedding. The fragmented texts, the DNA evidence, the burner phone linked to Robert, and the witness accounts of their intense conversation at the reception formed a rapidly solidifying case against the groom's uncle. The case against Robert Peterson was building, but there was still the troubling matter of the medical examiner's finding of recent sexual activity. Was this activity consensual? Was it related to the fatal encounter? The retrieved texts hinted at a planned meeting, not necessarily a struggle. This ambiguity needed to be resolved. Detectives revisited the witness statements about Sarah's interactions at the reception, particularly those involving Robert. The witness who saw them talking closely added more detail when pressed. Sarah looked cornered, almost, she recalled, like she wanted to end the conversation, but couldn't. Robert was leaning in close, talking low. He didn't look happy.
Yeah.
Investigators began to explore the possibility of a pre-existing relationship between Sarah and Robert Peterson. This was the turning point. The earlier midpoint reveal that accelerated the pacing and dramatically shifted the focus from an unknown assailant to the tangled web of family secrets. Through interviews with Sarah's close friends, initially hesitant to speak on sensitive matters, a devastating truth began to emerge. Sarah had confided in a few trusted individuals about a difficult situation she was in prior to the wedding. She had, months earlier, engaged in a brief clandestine affair with Robert Peterson. It had started innocently enough, a friendship blossoming into something more physical during a period of stress in Sarah's life. But it had ended badly, with Robert becoming increasingly possessive and difficult after Sarah tried to break it off and focus on her relationship with Mark. This revelation explained the tension seen at the reception, the cryptic texts, and the presence of Robert's DNA. The clandestine meeting mentioned in the texts was likely a final desperate attempt by Sarah to meet Robert and definitively end the situation before starting her new life with Mark. The medical examiner's finding of recent sexual activity could be interpreted in various ways given this context. It could have been a final, perhaps coerced encounter, or it could have been part of the planned meeting that then went horribly wrong. This earlier reveal of the affair injected a profound sense of betrayal and hidden history into the narrative, turning a simple murder investigation into a complex story of family, infidelity, and deadly secrets. The picture became clearer. Robert Peterson had been involved with Sarah Jenkins prior to her marriage to his nephew, Mark Peterson. The affair had caused significant stress for Sarah, particularly as the wedding date approached. She wanted it over. Robert, it seemed, did not. The fragmented texts retrieved from her phone took on a terrifying new meaning. They weren't just about a meeting. They were likely about a confrontation or a final plea from Sarah. "It needs to stop," one fragment read. "This is wrong." Another, seemingly from Robert's side. "You think you can just walk away?" This wasn't a secret lover. It was a potentially obsessive, dangerous man from her recent past, deeply embedded within the family she was marrying into. Further interviews confirmed the timeline. The affair had begun approximately 6 months before the wedding and ended, where Sarah attempted to end it, about a month prior. Robert Peterson had not taken it well. Friends described Sarah receiving persistent calls and texts from him, escalating in intensity. He had reportedly threatened to reveal the affair to Mark and the family if she didn't continue the relationship. Sarah had been terrified of the scandal, especially so close to the wedding, and even more so because David Peterson, Robert's brother and Mark's father, was a pillar of the community. The potential fallout could be immense, destroying not just her marriage, but severely damaging the reputation of the entire Peterson family. And then came the second devastating reveal, introduced earlier in the midpoint sections, to heighten the narrative tension. Investigators, still piecing together the full extent of Sarah's pre-wedding secrets, discovered further communications. These were not texts, but encrypted messages recovered from a hidden folder on Sarah's laptop, accessed after a warrant was obtained. These messages were between Sarah and David Peterson, Mark's father. They were less frequent than the texts with Robert, and more discreet, but their content was unmistakable. Sarah had also been involved, simultaneously for a period, with Mark's father. This was a separate, even more closely guarded secret. The depth of her entanglement within the Peterson family was far more extensive, and far more perilous than anyone, even her closest friends, had known. The encrypted messages with David Peterson were brief, cautious, and focused on managing their secret. One message from Sarah read, "We need to be so careful. Mark can never know." David's responses were equally guarded, often simple confirmations or brief logistical arrangements for meetings. There were no signs of conflict in these messages, unlike the increasingly fraught exchanges with Robert. However, the existence of this parallel, hidden relationship with the family patriarch added an almost unbearable weight to the situation. Sarah was navigating an incredibly dangerous path, entangled with both the groom's father and his uncle, secrets that, if revealed, would have caused an unprecedented family implosion just as she was marrying into that family. The motive for Sarah's murder began to sharpen into terrifying focus. It was no longer just about Robert Peterson's possessiveness. The intertwined relationships created a complex web of potential motives. Did Robert kill Sarah out of rage or fear of exposure? Did David play a role, perhaps fearing the consequences if his secret affair with his son's bride was revealed? Did the two brothers know about each other's involvement with Sarah, or was it a collision of secrets, one relationship leading to her death in the effort to protect the other, or perhaps a desperate act triggered by the impossible situation Sarah had created? The investigation now had two primary suspects within the same immediate family, linked by their secret connection to the victim. The pressure on Robert and David Peterson intensified. Investigators brought them in for separate, extensive interviews. Robert, when confronted with the DNA evidence in the burner phone data, became visibly agitated. He initially denied being at Sarah's house after the reception. When pressed about the DNA, he stammered, offering weak explanations about possibly brushing against her at the crowded reception. When the burner phone link was presented, he became defensive, refusing to answer further questions without a lawyer. His reaction was consistent with someone hiding a significant secret and potentially involved in the crime. David Peterson, in contrast, remained outwardly calm and composed during his interview. He expressed shock and sadness about Sarah's death. When asked about his relationship with Sarah, he described it as friendly, appropriate, given she was marrying his son. He denied any affair or inappropriate relationship. When confronted with the recovered encrypted messages, his composure finally fractured. but only slightly. His face tightened, and he requested legal counsel. His denial, delivered with carefully controlled emotion, stood in stark contrast to the damning digital evidence. His calm facade was a stark counterpoint to the tumultuous secret life revealed by the communications. The timeline of Sunday night was meticulously reconstructed, focusing on the movements of Robert and David Peterson after the reception. Security footage from businesses near the Roswell Historic Cottage captured both men leaving the venue separately. Cell tower data showed Robert Peterson's phone moving towards the East Cobb area, specifically pinging off towers near Sarah's residence, corroborating the burner phone data. David Peterson's phone data showed him returning to his own residence in East Cobb, and his phone remained there for the rest of the night. This suggested Robert was the one who went to Sarah's house. The likely sequence of events began to crystallize. Based on the evidence, Sarah had arranged to meet Robert Peterson after the reception, possibly to finally confront him and end their dangerous entanglement. The meeting likely took place at the house on Willow Creek Drive after Mark went down to the basement. The guest bedroom, unused and offering privacy, was the logical location for a clandestine conversation. The presence of Robert's DNA under Sarah's fingernails suggested a struggle. The strangulation indicated a violent confrontation. The sexual activity detected could have preceded the struggle, been an attempt by Robert to reassert control, or occurred during the confrontation itself. This was likely the moment where Sarah's desperate attempt to break free from the affair turned deadly. Investigators theorized that the meeting escalated. Sarah's determination to end things, perhaps coupled with a threat from Robert, could have triggered a violent reaction. Robert, fearing exposure, the potential scandal, and the destruction of his family and reputation, may have lashed out, resulting in strangulation. The fact that the murder occurred in the guest bedroom, away from the main living areas, and potentially within earshot of the basement, suggested a degree of planning or opportunity, a place where a secret meeting could happen unnoticed, and a struggle could be contained. The role of David Peterson in the murder itself remained unclear, despite his secret relationship with Sarah. His phone data placed him at his own home. There was no direct evidence linking him to the crime scene at the time of the murder. However, the knowledge of both relationships added another layer of potential motive and complicity within the family structure. Did Robert act alone, perhaps fearing exposure not just of his own affair, but also potentially of his brothers? Was there a conspiracy between the brothers? The evidence pointed most strongly to Robert as the perpetrator, but the lingering secret involving David cast a long, dark shadow over the entire family. Formal charges were brought against Robert Peterson based on the confluence of DNA evidence, burner phone data, retrieved communications, witness statements, and the established motive of a clandestine affair gone violently wrong. The Cobb County District Attorney's Office presented the case to a grand jury. An indictment was returned, charging Robert Peterson with the murder of Sarah Jenkins Peterson. He was arrested at his home in East Cobb without incident. The community, already reeling from the initial shock of the murder, was stunned by the revelation that the suspect was the groom's own uncle, and that the motive stemmed from a secret affair with the bride. The media coverage exploded once more. The scandalous details of the affairs with both the father and the uncle became public knowledge, fueling intense speculation and sensationalism. The Peterson family, once a symbol of quiet suburban success in Marietta, was thrust into the center of a devastating public drama. Mark Peterson, the groom, found himself navigating an unimaginable nightmare, marrying his love one day, burying her days later, and seeing his own father and uncle implicated in her death due to their secret relationships with her. His grief was now compounded by betrayal and public humiliation on an unprecedented scale. The legal process against Robert Peterson began. During pretrial hearings, the prosecution laid out their evidence, the timeline placing Robert at the scene, his DNA under Sarah's fingernails, the burner phone communications, and the established history of the affair and Sarah's attempts to end it. The defense argued that the DNA evidence was circumstantial, possibly transferred during the crowded reception, and that the burner phone and texts were subject to interpretation. They attempted to paint Sarah as someone with a complex personal life who might have had other enemies or secret encounters. However, the evidence regarding Robert's possessiveness and Sarah's fear of exposure, coupled with his physical presence at the scene during the critical time frame, proved compelling. While the details of David Peterson's affair with Sarah were part of the investigation's background and contributed to understanding the explosive family dynamics, They were not directly presented as evidence of David's involvement in the murder during Robert's legal proceedings, unless it became relevant to motive or potential conspiracy. The focus remained squarely on Robert Peterson and his direct link to Sarah at the time of her death. Testimony from Sarah's friends about her distress over Robert's behavior leading up to the wedding was crucial in establishing motive and her likely state of mind when agreeing to a final meeting. One friend, her voice trembling in court, as reported by local news outlets, recounted Sarah saying, "He's not going to let me go. I don't know what to do." This statement painted a picture of Sarah feeling trapped and desperate to resolve the situation with Robert before the wedding. The fact that the confrontation occurred in her home, after the ceremony meant to symbolize her commitment to Mark, added a layer of profound tragedy. The legal proceedings progressed, slow and meticulous. Forensic experts testified about the DNA transfer and the likely mechanism of strangulation. Digital forensic analysts detailed the recovery of the fragmented texts and the linking of the burner phone to Robert Peterson. Witnesses from the reception recounted the strained interaction between Sarah and Robert. The picture built by the prosecution was one of a secret relationship culminating in a violent act born of desperation and fear of exposure. The defense's attempts to introduce doubt about other potential individuals or scenarios struggled against the weight of the forensic and circumstantial evidence pointing directly to Robert Peterson. The fate of Robert Peterson was decided by a jury. After weeks of testimony, deliberation commenced. The evidence, while not a confession, presented a powerful case. The motive rooted in a forbidden affair, the physical evidence of contact at the time of death, the documented secret communication, and the lack of a credible alternative explanation. The verdict was returned. Guilty. Robert Peterson was convicted of the murder of Sarah Jenkins Peterson. He was sentenced to life in prison. The courtroom, filled with members of the Peterson family, including Mark and David, remained silent as the sentence was read, the weight of the tragedy and the unveiled secrets hanging heavy in the air. The conviction brought a form of legal closure, but offered little in the way of healing for those left behind. The Peterson family was irrevocably broken, their private lives exposed, their trust shattered. Mark Peterson, the young groom, was left to grapple with the unimaginable pain of losing his wife to a secret violent act committed by his own flesh and blood. The layers of betrayal, the lies, and the devastating violence left scars that would never fully heal. David Peterson, his own secret affair with Sarah, exposed, faced his own form of consequence, though not legal prosecution related to the murder itself. The knowledge of his actions, and the potential role they played in creating the unstable situation that led to the murder, remained a devastating burden. The house on Willow Creek Drive, the scene of such recent joy and swift horror, remained empty for a long time. A physical manifestation of the life that ended there. Neighbors walked by, their glances lingering on the now removed police tape. The memory of the wedding and the subsequent tragedy forever linked in their minds. The presents, once symbols of future happiness, were eventually packed away, their potential for joy forever tainted. The story of Sarah Jenkins Peterson became a cautionary tale in the community, a grim reminder that behind the facade of suburban normalcy, secrets could fester, and the consequences of their exposure could be devastating, even deadly. Her wedding day, meant to be the start of her new life, became instead the final act in a hidden drama, ending in violence in the quiet guest bedroom of her new home. The silence that followed her death was not just absence but the profound, haunting quiet of a life extinguished by betrayal and the collision of dangerous secrets within the very family she had chosen to join.